Hello and welcome to The Unseen Question. In 1692, in a small Puritan community in Massachusetts, fear became truth, rumor became evidence, and superstition carried more weight than reason. The Salem Witch Trials remain one of the darkest chapters in early American history, not because of the number of people killed, though 20 executions and countless ruined lives were tragic enough, but because they exposed just how fragile rationality can be when belief, fear, and authority align against common sense. What makes Salem so chilling is that the trials were not random acts of chaos. They were the predictable outcome of a society built on rigid dogma, where questioning authority was dangerous, and where the invisible world of spirits and demons was seen as more real than the physical evidence in front of people's eyes. The accusations began with a group of young girls who claimed to be afflicted by unseen forces. They cried out, convulsed, and pointed fingers at neighbors. Ministers and magistrates rushed to explain the behavior, not through medicine or psychology, but through the lens of their faith. If the Bible said the devil walked the earth, then clearly these girls were his victims, and someone in the community must be responsible. It's tempting to see Salem as a strange, outdated story, a bizarre footnote in history when people were too ignorant to know better. But the uncomfortable truth is that the dynamics at play in 1692 are not gone. They simply change form. The trials were driven by three powerful forces: fear, certainty, and the need for belonging. Fear of the devil, fear of outsiders, fear of disobedience, certainty that their beliefs could never be wrong, and the desperate need to prove loyalty to the community by siding with the accusers rather than the accused. Once accusations started, they spread like fire, because the safest place to be was not under suspicion but in the role of an accuser. In fact, it was far more dangerous to defend the accused than to accuse them. Those who tried to reason with the court or question the legitimacy of spectral evidence, the visions and dreams used as proof, often found themselves targeted next. This is how hysteria sustains itself. When truth is replaced with unquestioned belief, and when doubt itself becomes a crime. The Salem story is not just about witchcraft. It is about what happens when ideology gains the power to define reality. It shows how fragile justice becomes when people surrender reason to belief. The tragedy was not only that innocent people were executed, it was that the community was convinced they were protecting themselves, doing the righteous thing, even serving God's will. Their certainty blinded them to the fact that they were destroying their own neighbors. And this is the warning. Salem is not just a relic of superstition. It is a mirror showing how quickly a society can collapse into persecution when fear is mixed with dogma and enforced by authority. If you think this could never happen again, ask yourself, what are the modern equivalents of witches? Who do people say are secretly dangerous, corrupting society, or working with hidden forces? Who gets accused without evidence, condemned without fair hearing, because the community has decided they represent some invisible threat? In the 1950s, it was communists. Careers and lives were destroyed not through fair trials, but through accusations and blacklists. In more recent times, conspiracy theories spread about secret cabals, satanic cults, or hidden enemies infiltrating society. Always the same pattern. Fear becomes certainty, and certainty justifies persecution. And it isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle. When religious influence pushes laws that restrict freedoms, when school boards ban books for fear of corrupting minds, when leaders claim moral authority based not on reason but on their supposed connection to divine truth. These are all echoes of the same mindset that fueled Salem. The human mind is drawn to stories of good and evil, to the idea that misfortune must have a cause, and that unseen enemies are behind our problems. It's far easier to accuse a neighbor of witchcraft than to face the complexities of illness, poverty, or injustice. In Salem, the community chose the easy answer, and people died because of it. Today, we still choose easy answers. We still see scapegoats being blamed for social problems, from immigrants to minority groups, from scientists to skeptics. The form changes, but the logic is the same. Psychologists call this scapegoating, a process where groups under stress offload their fear onto a convenient target. In Salem, that target was the so-called witch. Today, it might be the person who doesn't conform to traditional values, or the group that challenges religious or cultural authority. What makes scapegoating so dangerous is that it feels righteous to those doing it. The accusers in Salem were not twirling their mustaches in secret villainy. They believed they were protecting their families. They believed they were serving God. In the same way, when modern politicians or religious leaders stir up fear against a group, their followers feel they are acting in defense of morality, order, or tradition. The Salem trials also highlight a critical flaw in the human mind. Once belief takes hold, evidence bends to fit it. In court, spectral evidence was accepted. People claimed to see ghosts of the accused, tormenting them. The judges insisted such visions were valid proof. To modern ears, it sounds absurd. Yet how different is that from believing in visions, prophecies, or miracles today? The willingness to trust subjective experience over measurable reality is the same. What stopped the madness in Salem was not an epiphany about reason or justice. It was exhaustion, political pressure, and the growing realization that too many respected citizens were being accused. When the governor's own wife was implicated, the trials came to an end, not because the system suddenly valued reason, but because the hysteria threatened the wrong people. But that should trouble us. It means that justice did not triumph. Fear simply burned itself out when it became unsustainable. And if fear drove the hysteria then, it can drive new ones today. Consider how many times in recent history fear has been used to justify injustice. Wars fought on the basis of threats that turned out to be false, civil liberties restricted in the name of security, communities divided over moral panics that later proved baseless. Each echoes Salem's logic. Belief first, evidence second. If there's one lesson to take from Salem, it's that societies must build safeguards against hysteria. Justice must rest on evidence, not belief. Laws must be secular, not theological. Free speech and open criticism must be protected, even when it makes people uncomfortable. Because once questioning authority becomes dangerous, hysteria finds fertile ground. Salem shows us how quickly people can surrender reason when they feel threatened. It shows us how dangerous it is when leaders claim divine authority or moral certainty. And it shows us how fragile freedom becomes when doubt itself is treated as guilt. We often think progress is automatic, that society naturally becomes more rational over time. But Salem is a reminder that progress is reversible. Under the right conditions, superstition can resurface, fear can dominate, and accusations can once again become more powerful than facts. The warning of Salem is not about witches, it's about us, about what happens when we let fear silence reason, when we let belief outweigh evidence, and when we choose certainty over doubt. In the end, the Salem Witch Trials remind us that the line between rational society and destructive hysteria is thinner than we want to believe. And that line can be crossed again, unless we learn to value truth above fear, evidence above faith, and reason above superstition. Because the real lesson of Salem is not that people once believed in witches. It's that people believed so strongly, so absolutely, that they were willing to kill for it. And whenever that kind of belief exists unchecked, history is always ready to repeat itself. When we talk about the Salem Witch Trials today, we tend to focus on the spectacle, the wild accusations, the hangings, the paranoia. But the deeper lesson lies in how ordinary people allowed extraordinary cruelty to feel normal. The trials were not carried out by monsters. They were carried out by citizens, parents, churchgoers, farmers, judges, people who thought of themselves as good, people who loved their families and wanted to keep them safe. And that's what makes it so unsettling. When fear grips a society, decency alone isn't enough. What matters is whether people have the courage to question the story they're being told. In Salem, that courage was rare. It was far safer to nod along, to stay quiet, to avoid becoming the next target. Silence became a kind of survival strategy. That same dynamic appears whenever institutions, religious or political, convince people that dissent is dangerous. It doesn't always lead to executions, but it always leads to conformity. And conformity, when driven by fear, can destroy more quietly than any gallows ever could. One of the most revealing parts of the Salem episode is how authority figures use their power. Ministers like Cotton Mather and Samuel Parris didn't invent the accusations, but they gave them credibility. They preached that Satan was at work in New England, that the community must purge evil to remain pure. Their words carried moral weight, and that weight crushed reason. When authority and belief merge, they form a kind of psychological trap. If you question the authority, you're questioning the faith. And if you question the faith, you must be on the side of evil. This is the loop that kept Salem trapped. And it's the same loop that still appears wherever ideology turns into identity. Think about modern movements that use moral panic to gain control. Those who oppose them are not merely seen as mistaken, but as wicked, as enemies of truth, morality, or the nation. The result is the same mechanism, fear weaponized by belief. The people of Salem didn't set out to destroy each other. They were trying to maintain order in a world that felt unstable. Disease, war, crop failure, all seem to signal divine displeasure. When you live in a worldview where everything is a message from God, every misfortune demands a cause. Someone must be responsible. That's how the witch hunts began. The unexplained had to be explained, and the explanation had to fit the theology. So instead of saying, "We don't know," they said, "The devil did it," and then looked for human faces to blame. This is one of the most dangerous human instincts, the refusal to accept uncertainty. We crave explanations, even false ones. We'd rather have a wrong answer than admit we don't know. And religion, historically, has offered endless wrong answers that feel emotionally satisfying. At Salem, the result was death. Today, it might be discrimination, policy built on pseudoscience, or the rejection of facts that threaten comforting beliefs. The mechanism is the same. Belief fills the gaps that reason refuses to decorate with lies. If you look closer at the Salem trials, you'll notice something interesting. Those accused of witchcraft were often the socially awkward, the outspoken, or the independent-minded, women who spoke their minds, people who didn't attend church regularly, or those who had property disputes with their neighbors. The accusations weren't random. They targeted those who didn't fit. Hysteria becomes a convenient way to punish difference, and that's another timeless pattern. When conformity is enforced by faith, individuality becomes suspicious by default. Even in the 21st century, we still see versions of this, where wrongthink or immorality are defined not by harm caused, but by deviation from the group's beliefs. The tools have changed, the vocabulary has changed, but the psychology has not. The Puritans of Salem believed that God was watching their every move, judging their community. That belief created immense anxiety. They lived in constant fear of divine wrath, which made them desperate to prove their loyalty. In that atmosphere, witch hunts become almost inevitable, because punishing others becomes a way of reassuring yourself that you're on the right side. The modern version doesn't need God to function. It can be political, ideological, or cultural. When people define their virtue by what they condemn, society starts walking the same path. Salem is not about witches. It's about the moral comfort of accusation. When fear and righteousness combine, reason doesn't stand a chance. One detail that often gets overlooked is the role of the courts. The trials were conducted with an appearance of legality. Witnesses testified, judges deliberated, verdicts were issued, but it was all theater, a ritual meant to give emotional decisions the illusion of justice. That should sound familiar. Throughout history, laws have been used not to protect truth, but to enforce belief. When evidence threatens faith, the law bends to faith. In Salem, spectral evidence, dreams and visions, was accepted because it confirmed what the community already believed. That pattern still exists. When lawmakers shape policy based on faith or superstition, instead of verifiable evidence, they're doing what Salem did, dressing fear in the clothes of justice. After the hysteria ended, a few survivors publicly confessed that they'd lied, that they'd been pressured or deluded. But no confession could bring back the dead, and no apology could erase the stain of what happened when faith overpowered doubt. Yet the story didn't end in despair. Years later, some ministers began to question the trials. A few even apologized for their role. It took time, decades, for Massachusetts to formally acknowledge the injustice, but it showed something important, that reason can recover, slowly, painfully, but only if people are willing to confront their own mistakes. That recovery, though, depends on humility. The humility to admit that belief can be wrong, that certainty can destroy, that conviction is not the same as truth. Without that humility, Salem will repeat itself, maybe not in name, but in spirit. You can already see its early forms whenever people accuse others based on ideology rather than evidence. When debates turn into moral crusades and disagreement turns into heresy. That's the Salem spirit, alive and well, wearing new clothes. It's no accident that societies built on unquestioned belief always end up persecuting the same kinds of people: the thinkers, the skeptics, the nonconformists, the ones who ask, "How do you know?" In Salem, that question was dangerous because it destabilized the story that kept everyone feeling safe, and that's why it's still dangerous today. The moment you question a sacred narrative, religious, political, or cultural, you become a threat to those who rely on certainty to feel secure. The lesson isn't simply that religion is dangerous, it's that any system that discourages doubt will eventually turn on its own people. Doubt is not weakness. It's a safeguard. It's what keeps belief from mutating into tyranny. The people of Salem lacked that safeguard. Their world was small, their beliefs absolute, and their leaders confident that they spoke for God. In that environment, reason didn't stand a chance. But we have no excuse. We have centuries of evidence, science, philosophy, and history showing us what happens when dogma replaces doubt. And yet the temptation to repeat Salem persists. Whenever we decide that someone deserves punishment not because of what they've done, but because of what they represent. Whenever we declare that questioning an idea is the same as attacking truth itself, we step onto the same path. The Salem witch trials may seem like ancient superstition, but they are more like a mirror, reflecting the parts of human nature that never really change: the need for control, the fear of uncertainty, the hunger for moral certainty. If America wants to learn from Salem, it must recognize that the greatest threat isn't witches or devils. It's the human tendency to believe too much, to question too little, and to confuse conviction with truth. Because once a society convinces itself that its beliefs cannot be wrong, everything that follows, no matter how cruel, will feel righteous, and history will once again repeat its quiet, terrible lesson. The Salem witch trials are often treated as an old moral parable, something to shake our heads at from a comfortable distance. But that distance is an illusion. The same psychological ingredients that created Salem exist in every generation, and when the right conditions come together, they produce the same outcome, only with new faces and new names. We tend to underestimate how contagious fear can be. In Salem, fear spread faster than logic could contain it. No one wanted to be left out of the collective certainty, and no one wanted to be next on the list. So, people lied, exaggerated, and nodded along to absurd claims because it felt safer than standing alone. Today, that contagion moves faster than ever. Through social media, through echo chambers, through mass outrage that punishes dissent in real time. What once took months to spread through a village now takes seconds to reach millions. And the same dynamic applies. Fear rewards conformity, and conformity amplifies fear. What's dangerous isn't just that people believe things without evidence. It's that belief becomes a marker of belonging. Once your community ties its identity to a particular story, whether religious, political, or moral, truth becomes a threat. And when truth is a threat, lies become sacred. This is why reason is so fragile. It requires emotional strength. It asks people to live without certainty, to tolerate not knowing, to accept complexity. And that's something human beings have never found easy. The people of Salem were not irrational because they were stupid. They were irrational because they were human. And humans crave clarity when the world feels chaotic. The Puritans believed that everything had a purpose, that every event carried moral meaning. That worldview made them feel safe, but it also made them vulnerable to hysteria. When bad things happened, disease, death, failed harvests, they couldn't accept that randomness existed. They needed to believe someone had sinned, someone had offended God, and that's when their moral certainty turned into moral violence. It's a pattern that repeats whenever people can't bear uncertainty. It happened in the Inquisition, when the Church sought heretics to explain why faith was fading. It happened during the Red Scare, when fear of communism justified witch hunts under a new name. It happens today when movements target anyone who questions sacred ideas. Each time, the story is the same: fear disguised as righteousness, violence justified by virtue, and reason left gasping under the weight of certainty. The Salem witch trials are often taught as a warning about superstition, but the deeper warning is about power. Religion provided the framework, but the real engine was control. When people are frightened, they will accept any authority that promises safety. That's what gives belief its political edge. Faith-based fear is easy to manipulate. It doesn't rely on evidence, only emotion. Once people believe they're defending something sacred, you can lead them anywhere. That's why Salem matters today, not as a historical curiosity, but as a reminder that the most dangerous weapon isn't belief itself, but the conviction that belief must never be questioned. When that mindset infects a nation, it can justify anything, from censorship to violence, from persecution to war. Because if your cause is holy, then no act can be too extreme. The people of Salem believed they were fighting for purity. Today, others believe they are fighting for freedom, morality, tradition, or truth. The words change, but the mechanism does not. Every generation thinks it's immune to hysteria. Every generation looks back at the last one and says, "We would never do that." But history says otherwise. The 20th century was full of educated societies that committed atrocities under banners of purity, faith, and national destiny, all convinced of their own righteousness. The human brain has not evolved as fast as our technology. We still respond to fear, shame, and belonging the same way the Puritans did. The difference is that our tools are more powerful, our reach more global, and our ability to destroy one another more efficient. So the question isn't whether another Salem could happen. The question is whether we would recognize it if it did. It probably wouldn't look like gallows and witch marks. It might look like public shaming campaigns, ideological purges, or the silencing of dissent under the guise guise of protecting truth. It might look like mobs convinced they are morally pure while destroying those who disagree. And when it happens, people will once again believe they are the good ones, just as the Puritans did. The solution to that isn't more belief, it's more humility. The recognition that certainty is dangerous, that truth doesn't belong to anyone, and that questioning is not rebellion but responsibility. Reason must be protected not because it makes us feel good, but because it's the only defense we have against hysteria. The only thing that stops belief from becoming cruelty is the willingness to say, I could be wrong. That phrase, simple, humble, human, is what Salem never learned. It's what every dogmatic movement tries to erase. Because once you allow doubt, authority weakens, and fear loses its grip. The trials ended, but the mindset survived. In every era since, you can trace its shape. In every movement that punishes thought, in every leader who claims moral infallibility, in every crowd that confuses emotion for evidence. We like to think of reason as our natural state, but it's not. Reason is a discipline, a choice that must be made over and over. It requires courage to stand alone when everyone else is shouting the same lie. In Salem, the truth was there all along. It just didn't matter until the hysteria touched the powerful. That's another lesson worth remembering. The system didn't collapse because it found its conscience. It collapsed because it overreached. That means progress doesn't happen by itself. It depends on people who are willing to stand in that uncomfortable space between fear and truth. The ones who refuse to accuse, who refuse to join the mob, who choose silence rather than lie and speech rather than obedience. If the Salem Witch Trials warn us of anything, it's that the line between civilization and madness is drawn by those people. The ones who ask for evidence, the ones who say, show me proof, the ones who choose honesty over safety. In every generation, that line must be redrawn, because hysteria never dies. It only sleeps, waiting for fear to wake it again. Maybe the real moral of Salem is that belief can make good people do terrible things, and that no one is immune. The moment a society decides its faith, its nation, or its ideology is beyond question, it begins the slow march toward its next witch trial. The victims of 1692 died for a lie that everyone believed was true. We owe it to them and to ourselves not to repeat that mistake, so the next time someone says questioning is dangerous, the next time belief demands obedience, remember Salem. Remember how quickly certainty becomes cruelty. And remember that reason, fragile as it is, remains humanity's best defense against its own fears. Because in the end, the Salem Witch Trials weren't about witches. They were about people. People who believed too deeply, questioned too little, and forgot that the search for truth is not an act of rebellion. It's an act of survival.